How incredible is it to have Julian here? You are so lucky to hear from him today and to have the opportunity to buy his book because it really is extraordinary. The book is an archaeological dig through the Holocaust, and the catalyst for it was a pivotal event that took place in the 1980s when Julian's father, Robert, was tragically found dead by suicide. Julian, throughout your life, your father's story was kept hidden, and you knew the basic outline. That he was born in 1927, he must have been 27, the same as
1927.
Yeah. And in 1938, when he was just 11 years old, living in Vienna, his parents put an ad in the Manchester Guardian advertising for somebody to look after him. They said, "I seek a kind person who will educate my intelligent boy," of course looking for an escape for him to leave Vienna, where the growing anti-Semitism had become so dangerous. When Robert was found dead in his 50s, you called up the woman who looked after him, Nance, his foster mother, and she said something really startling to you. She said they got him in the end. He was the Nazis' last victim. And of course, it took you a little while to start on this course, but you end up tracing a journey of what had he endured, what shadow had the Holocaust actually cast over him, and through that, you ended up looking at other children who were in those adverts to see what their lives, what had happened in their lives, what their trajectory had been, and what had happened as a result, and whether the Holocaust had indeed affected them as well. It is interesting that you took so long to write it, and the start of it actually happened accidentally. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, absolutely. And to say first, it's a complete honour to be here in Melbourne and on stage with you. Very grateful to be able to have this opportunity to talk about the book. Yes, the way this all happened was just a chain of accidents. I was talking to a retired law professor who was working to try and protect African asylum seekers, in particular Cameroonians, who'd come to the US, and in the last months of the Trump presidency, the Trump administration were trying to deport them all to possible death by being sent to back to Cameroon in the middle of a conflict. So we were exchanging emails, and then in one of these emails, this retired law professor, Ruth Hargrove was her name, said, "We keep revisiting the same trauma," and started talking about her father, who'd come from Vienna, who had never got over the trauma of what he lived through under the Nazis. And obviously, I immediately said, well, snap, we have a lot in common. And then it also emerged that her father's escape had something to do with an article written in the Manchester Guardian, which shook loose something that I'd been told in my youth about the Manchester Guardian having played a role in my father getting out, which I had, to my embarrassment now, I'd never properly gone after and looked. I imagined it be a very complicated thing to go through all the newspapers, and maybe there was a fear of maybe this myth isn't true. But for some reason, life went on, and I never, I stopped thinking about it. But this conversation, this exchange, brought it back. And so I asked the archivist at the Guardian, maybe this is something that is worth writing about, because the Guardian is coming up to its 20th anniversary, and it might be a theme. And the next day, I got an email from him, and in the email attachment was this advert: "I seek a kind person who will educate my intelligent boy, aged 11." And it was obvious that from the address and so that it was my father. And it had an enormous emotional impact, far more than I could predicted. To read words that had been written by my grandparents in desperation, trying to think of the words, the foreign language, would save my dad's life. And it was also immediately evident that he was far from alone. There were other people on the page, other kids just on that page. And so that was the starting point. It was obvious I had to go and find what happened to those children.
Do you think if you hadn't come across had that conversation with Ruth, you might never have done this? Would it have dawned on you to search this history?
I'm afraid to admit, maybe I would never have done it. I've just gone on with life, and all this that I've uncovered about my own family would have been left buried, which would have been a tragedy looking back on it, because there was so much that was not talked about the past of my family that had been left unsaid and buried.
But in the end, you actually start, like I said, on this sort of archaeological dig where you didn't realise how much there was to uncover, and you do find incredible things along the way that help you realise what your father went through. Can you talk about some of those discoveries, or at least one of the really important ones?
A lot of what had happened to my family was never discussed with us. By the time my mum met my dad in the 50s, he had already kind of climbed up. He no longer talked about the past. But when he'd been a schoolboy in Wales, because he'd been fostered in Wales, he was still a schoolboy, and the gate hadn't closed by then, and he had probably was a girlfriend who later wrote her memoir in Welsh. And so all this time there was a memoir in Welsh which had the stories that he had told her about life after the Anschluss in Vienna, that we had no idea about how they'd hidden in a cellar for 5 days, how his grandmother's piano had been thrown out of the apartment, the window of her apartment onto the street, and he had been chased through the streets by stormtroopers, brown shirts. All of this history had been buried and been out there in this Welsh memoir, and it was only when someone wrote and said, "Oh, but you might be interested to know it, and this is what it says," and translated for me. So that was one of the discoveries, but there were many.
It's incredible when you read the book to learn about this earlier version of your father, because even his name, Bobby, was one that you didn't know him as. He was somebody who was emotional, whereas you knew him as quite closed and impenetrable. And so I think that was really amazing. What I also loved was how you went through all the artifacts of your youth and of his youth, your grandparents' youth, to try and work out what it all meant. Things like you used to get sent Viennese sweets from your great aunt, which held an idea of how Vienna was part of your upbringing. And the same you found in your grandfather's collection, a zinc cross. Can you tell me about some of the things that you discovered that really meant something?
When my step-grandmother died, she left behind things that had belonged to my grandfather, and it was just a cardboard box of odds and ends, including 2 passports, these Deutschsprach passports with the J stamped in red, belonging to my grandfather and grandmother. There was a little enamel badge with a red carnation of the Social Democratic Party and my grandfather's membership booklet. And there was an alien's passport that he had to carry when he arrived in Britain. First stamp was saying he's a victim of Nazi persecution and is not to be interned. And then the next stamp was recording that he'd been sexually out of man, like most Central European Jewish men in 1940. They were all interned in the Isle of Man in a rather shameful first chapter of the Churchill government. And then, later inscriptions about how he'd been allowed to possess a bicycle and so on. And so these were all kind of, curiosities, and I carried them around with me sort of like talismans, believing they were somehow, said something about me, but I had no idea until I started writing this book what each of them meant, what the significance of that little badge was, the Social Democratic Party, what it meant to my grandfather, what the significance and the bureaucracy has surrounded the issuing of these passports, and what it was like to be a refugee in Britain during the war, and what it was like to be interned. I knew nothing about that. It was like I had a sort of series of dots, but I had no idea how to join them up. And it was in writing this book that I kind of invested this random collection of artifacts with some meaning and began to understand them.
It's a detective story in a few parts because you're chasing the trail of your father, but you're also at the same time combing through these adverts, using all means you can, from Google to genealogy sites, to try and find out the fate of these children. They're all fascinating stories, so different. They take us from Israel, Shanghai, the UK. Can you tell us about one or several of these stories?
I think the really remarkable stroke of luck that underpins this book, and it just wouldn't have been the same book if this hadn't happened. There were about 80 kids who were advertised in the Manchester Guardian over that period, 1938 to 39. And of those 80, a half dozen had written memoirs that hadn't been published, or they were just for the family. They'd written everything down. And a couple of others had given really extensive interviews, and one for a documentary about Shanghai and one for sort of Holocaust memorial. And it was really these personal recollections that were detailed and were thorough, that made the basis of the book. But what made them is that they were all so different. They showed the very different trajectories these children had gone on after being advertised in the Manchester Guardian. So one of them, for example, went to the UK, and like many refugees, got on a boat as soon as possible in 1940 to get over to the US, because by 1940 Britain no longer felt safe. So he went to the US, and he was just old enough towards the end of the war to sign up and join the US Army. And he became one of the Ritchie boys, which were Jewish refugees, mostly, who were trained as intelligence officers in Camp Ritchie in North Carolina, and sent back in. One of them was Henry Kissinger. Another one was one of the children of the book, George Mandler. And he ends up this group of Jewish refugees who put on US GI uniforms, and they were driving around in a jeep around the liberated territory in Europe, helping with interrogations of officers and so on. Ultimately, he finds himself in the woods of Germany, tracking down the remains of the SS. There was this fear at the end of the war that the SS would leave a kind of stay behind force to harry the occupiers, the Allied occupiers, and they were called the Werwolf, the werewolves. And so they were hunting for werewolves in the forest, and they're with a platoon of US soldiers, and they come across this hut, and the soldiers go in there, make sure there was no one in there, but it had been a hideout for SS remnants. And the three of them go in there, and there's a sealed box in there. They open it, and there are all these bite marks, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth in today's money. And these three guys just look at each other and think, well, no one knows this is our restitution. And so they all they all, pocketed the money, and Madler ended up buying a rare violin and some art and jewelry, and it was his, sort of auto restitution at the end of the war. But in a way, it's a real story behind the Tarantino Inglourious Basterds, where a group of Jewish guys going back into liberated Europe and doing a bit of sort of self-restitution.
And given that some of those memoirs were also about what they were going through and thinking about, not just what happened to them, did that help you shed light of who your father was and what he must have been going through? Because you didn't get the chance to interview him, but some of these people were very close in age to him, lived close by.
Yes. Yeah, and he was, every time I tried to ask him, because I had sort of techniques to try and get him involved. I did a history project about the Anschluss and thought, this will draw him in and he'll help me, it'll be a great project. And he just deflected. He wouldn't teach us German and so on. And so, yes, I knew very little about this time in his life that was just dark. But the first guy I found in terms of looking for these children from the classified ads was George Mandler, this guy who ends up as a US intelligence officer. And he also goes on, like my father, to be a psychologist. So they both grew up in the 3rd District. They're both kind of left of center politics, and they're both psychologists. And his book called Interesting Times is just a fascinating read about what it was like to be a boy in Vienna, what it was like to lose all that, what it was like to arrive in the UK. And so it helped me at least have an educated guess of what it would have been like for my father, and also create a framework on which I could hang imaginings of what that was like, and imagining my father in the queue for the snacks in the Prater, the fun fair. He talks about a boy's life, and I could imagine my father sort of side by side with him. So it was really important, and it didn't tell the story of my father, but it told the story of the world in which my father grew up.
I think one of the hardest things about this book is that overall, when you hear about stories of survival, there's that element of triumph in them, and you think that's the end of the story. These children were rescued, they lived a life, they didn't die, and you feel good about that. But then when you read bit by bit what happened to them, you realise how much they lost. Language, home, family, opportunities, just one thing after the other. Did you realise going in what that would feel like, the poignancy of that?
Yeah, I think what it really drove home is the thing about war, this fundamental fact about war is that the violence, immediate violence, is just the beginning, and that the consequences go on for generations, especially as in the case of my family, where nothing was talked about. For example, I really grew up thinking, well, my family, at least they got out scot-free, not scot-free, but without, losing anyone. That was completely untrue. But the people who were killed weren't talked about in my family. Their pictures were not on our wall. It's as if they had been edited out. And one of the reasons why I'm very, lucky that all this happened, I got to write the book, is that I was able to kind of restore them and their memories, which have been completely whitewashed over in the interest of having a fresh start and a new identity.
And that was especially true when it came to your great aunt, Malchi, and her son. That was a huge discovery for you on a personal basis, yes, to find out the fate, especially of your father's cousin, Mordecai.
Yeah, absolutely. Malchi was my great aunt, and she was a sort of peripheral figure in our lives. She would come and visit from time to time, and she would send at Christmas. She would send these Mozartkugeln, Mozart balls, and the manna wafer, especially during the strikes in the 70s, 3-day weeks, which obviously thought we were starving in Britain, and we'd send these sort of Red Cross packages to us. And we grew up, she was a very short, diminutive, rather odd-looking woman who wore this traditional Viennese little cap with a feather in it and this overcoat and these shin-high boots. And that generation in my family was sort of treated as being rather amusing, slightly embarrassing, or what we're going to do about Malchi. When she came, we had to hide our guns away, and I understood that she'd had really traumatic time. But it was really only when I was working on this book and I went into the Vienna Resistance Archives, where I realized who she was and what she was, this tiny figure, peripheral, slightly derided in our family. But in the archives, she was a giant. She was a member of an Austrian network within the French resistance, who were extremely effective and influential because they could infiltrate, because they had the language and they could pose, and they could work in German offices under the occupation. Malchi had traveled to Paris when, after the Anschluss, with her son, Mordecai, known as Motti. And they traveled then, when Paris fell, to the south of France and become part of this network. And Motti was sent in as part of this network to infiltrate steelworks, the Hermann Goering steelworks in Linz, and to impersonate a French migrant worker, and to burrow in and then start to gather intelligence and necessary sabotage. But what was emerged from the papers in the resistance archive was that he had been let down, uncovered by incompetence on the part of his fellow members of the cell. My great aunt Malchi had always thought that he'd been given away by a comrade, but it was just a mess up. Someone was traveling to Paris and was supposed to meet a contact, contacted in a show, and what they were supposed to do was come back at the same time the next day. But she panicked and went to a safe house, but it was a safe house that the Gestapo were already watching. She got arrested, and in her bag were under a false bottom was all the details about the network. And so a couple of days later, the Gestapo turned up at the Linz Steelworks, arrest Mordecai, and he spent months under torture and ended up dying of disease, but after 4 months of torture. We knew hardly any of this. We knew, Motti grew up almost like a brother to my father, because my father's an only child. Motti was close in age. There are these pictures, they're always together. And yet, in our family, my father never mentioned him. His picture wasn't on the wall. And it was, quite overwhelming to kind of, to dig this out and to bring him back to life.
And in fact, when you went to a cemetery in Vienna and saw a tombstone for him, it had words on it that, I guess, showed you the way forward, what had been done in the past, and the idea of restoring who he was for people.
Yes, because it had the words of, your sacrifice will not be forgotten, unforgotten. And it had been a promise we hadn't kept, it had been forgotten. And it was one of the sort of blessings of writing this book, is to be able to, that kind of sacrifice, that kind of heroism will be remembered rather than hidden, that his memory should be restored, and that we would feel different about ourselves, that we weren't just the sort of descendants of people who had been canny enough to escape, but we were also descendants or part of a family of whom some had resisted.
And this is a really restorative work in many ways, because you're restoring those stories of what happened, but you're also restoring the memory you've got of your father, understanding it better. You say that at the end that you don't really understand why he did what he did, but did you think you came close to understanding him nevertheless?
I think you can never, it would be glib, I think, to say, well, this happened, therefore, obviously, he took his life. None of the other 80 kids in the book had taken their lives. It's obviously going to be complicated. How can you ever understand an act like that? A man with 4 children doing that. But it created a context in which he took his life. It created a context of someone who had always lived in fear. And had tried to deal with that fear by just covering it up, not talking about anything, and pretending to be something. And that, yes, it changed my view on what he did. Right, this bit is from the basically introduction. And it talks about, it comes after coming across these adverts, looking through the adverts and the various appeals in those adverts for these children's lives to be saved. And I've just got my glasses on so I can read it. Before the Kindertransport, newspaper ads were one of the very few options available for Jewish parents trying to get their sons and daughters out of Nazi-run Austria. A total of 80 children were advertised in the Manchester Guardian, almost all from Vienna. Their virtues described in brief to fit the confined space at the cost of a shilling a line. They'd grown up on the same streets at the same time as my father. So what had happened to them all? Had they all managed to survive, or had their parents' appeals for help gone unheeded? I set out to trace them. Having stumbled on their names, it seemed unthinkable not to try and find out what had happened to them, and if it was too late to track them down in person, to at least find their children, who would presumably be about my age. At the same time, I felt compelled to follow my own father's faded traces, overlooked for so long. I had no clear preconceptions of where the search would take me, and I would frequently be astonished by the stories that lay behind those 3-line ads. The trail led from the hushed Vienna archives to the Shanghai ghetto to a suspected Bolshevik spy deported from 1920s France, only to vanish mysteriously, a secret Austrian cell within the French resistance, and a lapse in judgment that led to its obliteration at the hands of the Gestapo. A US military intelligence unit chasing the remnants of the SS through the German forests and fighting a horde of Nazi cash. A phenomenal Jewish football team which beat the world's best before being burnt off the pages of sporting history in the Holocaust. And an astounding tale of love and survival that led through Theresienstadt, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the chaos of the World War's final days. It finally led to a video call to New York, in which I got to ask questions of a living witness, questions I should have put to my own dad. The exploratory journey into my own family's past was like spooling a video ever faster backwards across the generations. Colour turned to black and white, cities gave way to villages, modern roads petered out into rough tracks, leading to younger incarnations of men and women who I'd only known in their last years, and other ancestors I'd never met, speaking different languages and leading unrecognizable lives, all blithely unaware of the horrors hurtling towards them. Hilary Mantel once said that history is what's left in the sieve when the centuries have run through it. And that is exactly how it felt researching this book. I spent months sifting through remnants and guessing how they might fit together. what they might tell me about my family and the ways they shaped me and my generation, the children of survivors, and the way we see the world. They were long dead, but not yet departed. And just now and then they flickered back to life, stepping out of history in their prime, some as heroes, some as victims, all transformed in ways I could not have anticipated.
What you ended up discovering was that there was so much information to unearth that you didn't realise was there. And I wonder if you now urge people, especially in Australia, you know, we've got the largest influx of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel per capita. But on top of that, we all have important historical stories. Do you now try and urge people to uncomb and look for their own stories and tell them?
Absolutely. I've become, a real sort of evangelical about it. That's wrong term. But because there is so much out there that I could never imagine that was being retained. The Austrians in particular, and the Jewish community in Vienna in particular, were meticulous about keeping records. The Nazi system left a lot of records, and so much of it is being digitalized, and I was able, for example, I wrote the Austrian State Archives and gave a reference number that I found online for my family's sort of affairs. And a few months later, this enormous envelope, the size of a doorstep, arrived. And I thought, this is going to tell me lots of aspects of my family. It just told me, in fact, an awful lot about one thing, and that was the process of Aryanization. In meticulous detail, how basically the family shop was ripped off, and how it was rigged so that the buying price would be artificially lowered, but it was all wrapped up with all this legalese. But in between are the letters written by the guy who wanted to take over the shop from my grandfather, saying, this is unfair, little details about how, yes, you can't charge for this music because these are by Jewish composers and therefore under the right they're worth nothing. So, and then the 5 pianos that had to be handed over to the Jewish property office and so on. Just a wealth of detail, and it's all out there. And I think writing this book, it really brought home to me the importance of us telling our family origin stories. It made me think of, in traditional cultures, this is recited as part of life. And it tells you where you are in space and time, your place in the universe. And it's something that we, especially, my family, has stopped doing. And I think it's part of the human condition to go on and find it out, whether it's good or bad. Just the facts are important to mental health. It's important, I think, to a sense of identity, or to my sense of identity. It changed me doing this book. And in going out there, I had no idea of how much material there would be and how much I would find out, because by the time I started looking, everyone was already dead, but they lived on in the archives and in other people's memories, like this Welsh memoir, ways I couldn't never have predicted.
And just in broad terms, where do you suggest people start if they're doing it? I know that in my case, I started with Holocaust museums, but went on to Facebook pages that were connected to either Czechoslovakia or the Holocaust. In your case, I think you tweeted at one point, you Googled, you did a whole bunch of different things apart from combing through all the regular channels. Yes,
with me, what was really instrumental as a first step was a website called jewishgen.org, which just lists everything that is known about Jewish communities in Central Europe. There's a lot, if you're from Austria, there's a lot there because the IKG, the Jewish community in Austria was pretty organized, and there's a lot there. And so when it came to looking for names, that was my starting point, because it would give births, marriages, deaths, and dates of deportation. And that was a starting point. And then to take to other sites like Ancestry.com, findmypast.co.uk, and so on. And it's just mind-boggling how much that's been digitalized. And then other people have been on there who may have connections to whose families overlap and so on. And you go down a rabbit hole, but it's a very interesting rabbit hole.
Yeah. As Debbie mentioned before in the intro, you've spent a lot of time travelling, and there was something interesting you wrote in your book. You said, "I often felt the presence of a trapdoor lurking under my daily life, left behind by an unseen past. I dealt with it when I was young by travelling." I was wondering, to the extent that the sense of belonging affected you and affected your father too. You come from a family that was very assimilated, had not many ties to Judaism even before the war, and continued on. And I was just wondering if you think that affected both your father and you.
Yeah, I really think so. I mean, it may not be a sort of simple case of, you belong to a faith that therefore you have instant community, or you belong to a certain kind of club, or you go to organizations that are all from people who come from the same place. But I growing up, I had very much the feeling that somehow, though we were somehow pretending, we're pretending to be people that we weren't quite. My father brought with him, I think, this instinct that comes especially from Viennese Jews, to burrow in and to rise and to protect yourself by assimilation and success and melding into the environment. And it obviously didn't work in Vienna, but I think my father took it to the UK and was focused on very limited ideas of success, academic success. It was obsessed with academic success. It was obsessed about sort of fitting in with the London bourgeois, even though he didn't earn the kind of money that he put in there. And one of the awful, tragic, slightly pathetic things about his death is he just disappeared, and we didn't know where he was. This was 1983. We didn't know where he was, and we were trying to rack our brains where he would have gone. Could he have gone to that person, this person, that person? And he had actually given us a clue some months before, when he announced out of nowhere that he'd joined the Liberal Club, something extremely posh in London, and we just laughed. It was just a ridiculous thing. But looking back on it, I think it was, in a way, he was beginning to sort of stage the details of his own death. And so he would have died in his club, which had a sort of ring about it that he had arrived in this, in these circles. And of course, the other thing, one of the surprises that I found out in researching the book, that I hadn't been told, was that his last trip, where he went directly after leaving Ireland, was he went to find Nance, who would really, who was he'd be his foster mum. And his instinct at that time was not to go to any, London friends, but to go and see the woman who was the one person left alive who had known him as a young boy, as Bobby, this frightened 11-year-old refugee who they had to take the whistle off the kettle because he freaked out when he heard it, because it sounded like, the brown shirts rounding up Jews. It told me a lot about what was going through his mind in those last days. That he had sought out this woman who knew him in a way that no one else did. and that he'd gone back to that person rather than the person he'd spent so many years, decades trying to be. And so when I had rung Nance to tell her about his death, what she didn't tell me, what she knew is he had come to find her. She'd gone, it was very rare for her, she'd gone away to Wales and she wasn't there. And so he just sat in the driveway until her daughter-in-law came and gave her some biscuits and tea, and then he left. And a couple of days later he died. And so when she said to me, this is the Nazis' latest victim, they got him an end, she knew that is what he'd gone back to, at the end of his life. And so must have felt just awful not to have been there when he turned up.
And I think a lot of this book talks about the futility of trying to bury the past, that the children who end up in lots of ways feeling better about their past are the ones that talk about it, where the families are more open, and you can see a suffering that happens with everyone, not just the people who this has happened to, but their children and even grandchildren when things are buried.
Yeah, it makes me think in the African American Museum in Washington, you go in and there is this quote from James Baldwin that's projected on the wall. And it talks about history, personal history. And if I can remember it right, it is the great force of history is the fact that we carry it within us. It unconsciously, it controls us, and it is literally present in all that we do. That, you might not be interested in your own history, but your history may not be ready to let go of you. And I think until you face it, until you talk about it, are able to talk about it and be at peace with it, it will always control who you are. And I thought that was why it was so important to talk about. It was why it's so important to write this book, that unless we're able to talk about it, unless we're able just to tell the story of what happened, that we remain controlled and damaged by it in ways that we can't control.
And I guess that leads me to my last question before I open it up to the floor for anyone who wants to ask questions. Like me, we've both come out with books that deal with anti-Semitism at a time when there's never been more anti-Semitism in the world since the Holocaust. What lessons do you think there are in your book for people to learn today?
I mean, that's big. Someone, I like to think it was my father, and I think it was my father who said this at some point when I was growing up. He said that people came out with the Holocaust with one of two conclusions. One, that this is something that should never happen again to Jews. And the others who came out and said this is something that should never happen again to people. And I think, in terms of how we look at what's going on now, it's kind of important to ask that question. What lessons do we draw? And I would like to think that the lessons that I draw from doing this research, and also the lessons I draw from having covered the Bosnian War and gone to Jerusalem and spent time there, is that if we can draw anything from that, those experiences, and if there is something that the people who survived and their descendants can draw and bring from that experience, is that the fundamental lesson of never losing sight of your and other people's humanity. And that what happened to the children in these adverts shouldn't happen to children anywhere. And children refugees who are coming in to Britain, Australia, and the US now from all over the world are not fundamentally no different from these child refugees who were saved by people like the Bingleys.
Well, it's a book of great compassion and eloquence, and I hope that those who have a book should buy another one for a friend. And I wanted to say thank you so much to Melbourne Jewish Book Week, to you, Debbie. Thank you to Avenue Books and the wonderful Chris, who is fantastic. Everyone should support the Avenue. And everyone give a round of applause to Julian Borger.